Happy Tuesday and welcome back to another exciting episode of the Rocketeer Minute, where each and every day, Monday through Friday, we go over 1 minute of the greatest adventure movie Walt Disney's ever made, the 1991 Joe Johnston-directed feature, The Rocketeer. I'm one of your hosts, Jim O'Kane of TVDads.com.
And I'm Hal Bryan, an airplane nerd from the Experimental Aircraft Association here in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And Jim, what a great guest we have today. This guest is the brains behind a terrific website, one that I've known for years and years, airships.net. And he's also an author of a new book that came out in May called Zeppelin, Hindenburg, An Illustrated History of LZ-129. And I have a lifelong fascination with airships, but I don't pretend to know anything when Dan Grossman is in the room. So Dan, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. What a pleasure to be talking about airships.
It's definitely, this is our week for Zeppelins, and you're just the man for the job. We've been watching this fight developing between Neville and Clifford, and hit anybody that gets in his way, including the pilot, who I guess he's just lighting the load by about 80 or 90 kilos by sending him out the hatch there, and now he's threatening Jenny. But that's not important right now. Let's talk about. Let's talk about the Luxembourg here, which I guess we're assuming is like a would-be sister ship of the Hindenburg. How close is that control cabin there, similar to the Hindenburg itself?
It's reasonably close, certainly good enough for literary license. They've taken a little license, but it kind of gives the basic idea. It was a bare, functional area. It wasn't really decorated. It was exposed duralumin girders and controls. There's a spiral staircase, which is a bit of a poetic license. There was actually just a straight little aluminum ladder, but it gives the sense of being in a control area that was built for function, not for decorative purposes.
Yeah, it seems like now when they were on duty, what was the typical cockpit crew composed of? How many people were up there while the ship was in flight?
There was a helmsman who controlled the rudder. That's lateral movement, left, right. There was probably the most important crewman was the elevator man. He controlled the elevators, which handled pitch up and down, and he faced sideways to be oriented with the axis that he was controlling, and he had a board that showed all sorts of information that he needed in order to control the pitch and the altitude of the ship. There usually was a senior officer who was in command. There was a ballast board, which generally wasn't used en route, but was used in landing and takeoff, and that would drop ballast, water ballast, to make the ship lighter. There was a gas board, so you had someone controlling the gas board. And that had valves so that you could release hydrogen lifting gas to make the ship heavier. In the cabin behind there, and there were engine controls. There were engine telegraphs, somewhat similar on a ship. Behind there was a navigation room where you had a navigator, and that person plotted the course, and also they received weather reports and plotted those on weather maps. So flying this took a fair number of people. These ships were not flown like an airplane. They were commanded like a ship. And so you had a crew of people, as you would on the bridge of a ship, each one with a particular function, who worked together as a team. It's not like one person in a cockpit with the throttle in one hand and the yoke or stick in the other. It's really like sailing a ship more than flying a plane.
Well, I've seen pictures of different Zeppelins under construction, and the incredible lattice work to hold all the envelopes, the gas envelopes in place was quite intricate. How long would it take to build a ship of this size? Did it take months, years?
It took several years. Hindenburg was first laid down in 1930, 1931, and was not completed until March of 1936. Part of that was financial, the reaction to the Depression. They started it, but then they kind of didn't have any money. Then when the National Socialists took over, they infused a lot of government money into it, and so construction really began in earnest in around 1935. But it would at least take a year or two. Now, during World War I, when of course there was combat concerns, the Zeppelin company was able to crank these out pretty quickly. Military production is often quicker than civilian production, and to some degree the goal was quantity, as much as quality. But a big commercial ship like the Hindenburg or the Luxembourg would have taken at least a year, maybe two.
Now, Dan, the Luxembourg in this film is given the registration number LZ-130, and as I recall, and I think I've brought up a couple of times, that was actually assigned to the Graf Zeppelin II. Is that correct?
It was taken. Actually, it wasn't the Graf Zeppelin II. It was simply the Graf Zeppelin. There was never a II because they were planning on retiring the LZ-127 Graf Zeppelin, so they wouldn't really have operated at the same time. So, but the LZ-130 was a very, very similar copy, built to the same blueprints, a couple of small distinctions between Hindenburg. But Hindenburg did have an almost identical sister ship, LZ-130 Graf Zeppelin, and that number, of course, they use on Luxembourg in the film.
Right. So it was the second Graf Zeppelin, but not Graf Zeppelin II.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
They didn't put the two on it, just a small technical detail, trivia.
Now, you mentioned the sort of engine telegraphs like we would see on a ship. Was there a separate, was there an engineer closer to the engines actually sort of manually adjusting throttle positions and things in response to command from the cabin?
Absolutely. Each engine car, sometimes engine pod, had an engine and an engineer or mechanic who was on duty 24 hours a day. That engine was never running without a human being standing within inches of it.
Wow.
And what would happen is the officer in the control car would ring the engine telegraph to the speed that was desired. And just like you've seen in the movies about ocean liners or battleships or naval ships, in the engine, right next to the engine, there was a corresponding engine telegraph, and it would ding ding to alert him that a new order is coming through. And then a needle would move, and it would point to the speed that was required. And then the mechanic would manually adjust the engine for whatever speed had been ordered from the control car. So it's not like an airplane or certainly like an automobile where you press a throttle and the engine automatically does something.
Right.
You give a command, and then the engineer mechanically with his hand changes the throttle setting for the engine in response to the command.
Yeah, it sounds very similar to a ship, like that you send commands to the engine room and they do all the adjustments.
Exactly, same thing.
And very quickly before we leave the topic of engines, they were using differential power for maneuvering and everything, of course, right? So for tight turns and things like that. So were there 4 separate telegraphs in the control cabin, in the cockpit?
There were indeed. Okay. Each engine could be operated independently.
The Hindenburg and this sister ship here, the Luxembourg, were obvious generational designs of a Zeppelin. What improvements did the Hindenburg class of Zeppelin bring to the line, like technological improvements?
The biggest improvement was probably size. It was very, very much larger than what came before. And so the efficiency of a lighter-than-air craft often depends purely on size. The more lifting gas, the more you can lift. And so the passenger capacity, the carrying capacity, the range, because range is a function of how much fuel you can carry, and fuel is heavy. So all of those attributes increase when you increase the size of the ship itself. And Hindenburg was just significantly larger than its predecessor or any of its predecessors. So that was probably the biggest single difference. But there were other mechanical changes. It had one of the first autopilots of any aircraft. It had a number of interesting technical innovations, but mostly it was just a lot bigger, could fly farther, and carry a lot more.
The Zeppelins at this point in history, here in 1938, about 18 months, roughly 15 months after the Hindenburg disaster in May of 37, these, we look at them in hindsight and we see the big red emblem on the tail with the swastika and things. We tend to think of them as military, but these were not. These were still effectively airliners, correct?
Correct. They were airliners. The world's first intercontinental airliner was a Zeppelin. The first airliner that carried passengers on a regular schedule across an ocean from one continent to another was a Zeppelin. And these were civilian commercial ships. The Germans actually created a company called the DZR, the Deutsche Zeppelin Reederei, which was an airline. And that airline existed to operate these airships. Of course, the government involvement during the NS time was the government was involved in everything in Germany during that time. And so there were certainly lots of Luftwaffe involvement and military overlap, and everything had a potential military application. They sent, for example, Luftwaffe observers to learn about navigation and signals and communications and things like that. So there was some integration, some cooperation between the military and civil authorities. But at their heart, these were commercial airliners.
How do you think, just subjectively, how do you think they did on things like the uniforms and the cap insignia and stuff like that? Does that look reasonable to you?
Oh, they definitely capture the concept. It's not spot on. They take a little license, but then again, the whole thing is they take a lot of license in the movie, which is appropriate for a film like this. It's an adventure story, but it was basically the same. These were all modeled on naval uniforms. The kind of the aesthetic was modeled after the Navy, which is what the American airships did as well, because these things were a lot more like ships than they were like planes.
By the end of Hindenburg's career, it had made something like, what was it, like somewhere around 60 transatlantic crossings. Graf Zeppelin before that certainly had a number of sort of high profile visits, like that trip to the Chicago World's Fair in 1933. Can you step us through sort of quickly, like what was a flight like, compared to especially compared to a modern airline trip, other than it took a lot longer? If I'm going to go from, Friedrichshafen to Lakehurst or something like this, what kind of a trip am I going to have on one of these airships?
Well, it was relaxing. It was pleasant. You have to compare it to the alternative technology of the day. If you wanted to go from Germany or anywhere in Europe to the United States, the only other way to go was by ship. And the fastest ship crossed in 5 to 6 days. And the biggest issue was you were likely to spend a lot of that time seasick. So you, unless you were very lucky and had an unusually smooth crossing, you were likely to lose your lunch at one point during this crossing. A lot of people were terrified. The idea of having to cross the Atlantic was just terrifying to people because they were terrified about getting sick, and many people did get sick. Probably the biggest secret weapon that Zeppelins had was that no one ever got seasick. And if you're imagining 2 to 3 to 4 to maybe a full 5 days of just green around the gills misery versus 2 to 2.5 days of drinking wine, eating food and never feeling queasy, that's just a huge advantage. The obvious advantage was speed. You could cross the Atlantic twice as fast. But the secret weapon was comfort. It was comfortable. It wasn't comfortable because it was big. Obviously, the quarters were a lot smaller than an ocean liner. The cabins were smaller. The public areas were smaller. It wasn't really luxury in the sense of grand rooms, but it was certainly luxury in the sense of comfort, in that you didn't have to worry about losing your lunch. And that would have been a huge advantage to people thinking about crossing the Atlantic at the time.
And how many people could make that crossing? Was that somewhere around 80? Am I close there?
When Hindenburg was first built, it had cabins or had berths for 50.
Okay.
When it became obvious that they were not going to get any helium from the Americans, they expanded that and they added berths so that when it finally, during the 1937 season and when it crashed, it had sleeping berths for 72 passengers.
That's similar to the number of people that showed up for the Movies by Minutes Chicago. We could have hosted an entire conference up in a dirigible.
And crossed the
Atlantic.
And nobody gets seasick. That's great.
But I bet the operating expenses would have been a little higher than what y'all did. I just have a feeling.
What would a ticket go for back then? I mean, in $1930, how would that?
It was $400. It was $400 each way in 1936. $450 each way in 1937. Conversion is tough because there are 15 different ways to convert old dollars to new dollars. But it was expensive. It was basically the same cost as crossing the Atlantic first class on a ship like the Queen Mary or the Normandy. So if you could afford a first class cabin on the Queen Mary, you could afford to cross on Hindenburg. Now, not many people could afford either, but it was roughly in the same category.
And that would be roughly somewhere in the ballpark of the price of a new car of the era, something like that. So not necessarily something that sort of an average middle-class family could afford to do, but by any stretch of the imagination, you probably weren't welcome. Is it?
it's probably competitive to Concorde if you
sure.
think about it. And in terms of, and when I've seen people attempt to convert $36 to modern day dollars, you roughly get a ticket price that's kind of similar to what Concorde charged when it was operating.
Yeah, I think as Hal said, being able to compare what you'd need, what else you could buy with that,
right?
About where it's at, and just try and imagine: do you want to get a car? Do you want to just go on a Zeppelin?
Yeah, sure. I know which I'd pick, but I've never been very practical.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm right there with you. Yeah, we'll be walking to work.
Exactly.
I just want to expand this outward a little bit more. A lot of places that having Beaux-Arts style buildings in a lot of downtown areas, a lot of people point to different towers and masts and say that was actually designed as a mooring mast for Zeppelins. How many places do you know of in the U.S. were planning on having regular Zeppelin work? I know of at least in Chicago. I know the Empire State Building was once considered as a mooring. The tower was going to be a mooring mast. Providence, Rhode Island has a building that actually has a waiting room for Zeppelins in their largest towered building. Was that a frequent part of metropolitan areas during the 20s?
Well, if you ask how many buildings actually expected to be landing docks for Zeppelins, the actual answer is 0, because no building was ever designed to actually do this. It was pretty much a publicity stunt. There's a building in, I believe it's Birmingham, Alabama, which has this spindly little tower, which a Zeppelin, if it moored to this spindly little tower, the slightest gust of wind would just rip this tower right off the building. And of course, it's hard to imagine anybody really, how much passenger traffic in the 1930s was there between Berlin and Birmingham, Alabama? A lot of these buildings did that as a publicity stunt. Everybody wanted to be associated with Zeppelin. Zeppelins were the future. They could never have landed at these buildings. Even the one at the Empire State Building, it had been completely impractical to ever attempt to dock a Zeppelin at a building like that. And they never made any attempt to coordinate with the Germans to say, hey, if we want to dock your Zeppelin, what size fitting should we have? What are the technical requirements? They never did any of the work you would have needed to do if you actually wanted one of these to land. The goal was to associate a building or a company or a town with the future. And the Rocketeer is really all about futurism. That's the dream sort of the movie. And it was a dream of the time. It was the future, how bright and wonderful and cool. Look what we can do. Look what science and technology can do for us. Look at these amazing things. Look how wonderful the future will be. And so if you wanted to be associated with that sense of wonder of the future, in the 1930s, Zeppelin was where it's at. So everyone wanted to associate themselves somehow with this just wonderful miracle concept.
Yeah, if you look at the Cirrus X3 jetpack, it looks like 2 Zeppelins tied to his back.
Or 2 vacuum cleaners.
Yes, exactly.
That's true, yeah.
It always comes back to the vacuum cleaners, doesn't it?
Oh, gosh. Also, just to satisfy my curiosity, were the windows on Zeppelins made out of easily broken glass, or do you know if they were made out of like Perspex or?
It was a sort of an early version of the same stuff that you use for airplane
like a
windows.
plexiglass or lucite?
Yes, exactly. Plexiglass. It was sort of an early version of plexiglass. So they were not glass.
Yeah. You weren't gonna crack them and fly out the window with the first time some woman steps on your shoe in her high heels. So okay,
no, They wouldn't shatter like that. No.
And here's another arcane question. So Jim, I'll see your glass question and raise you to the floor. In a couple of scenes in this minute, we're looking right down at the floor, and it's to me, it's a little bit reminiscent of something like teak decking on an ocean liner. But what would that flooring have been?
The flooring in the control car would have it was basically aluminum sheets with overgirders and stiffeners. There was very little wood. Wood is heavy. Wood doesn't have a lot of advantages. Aluminum and duralumin are light and strong, so wood isn't something that was really used a lot.
And I'm not 100% convinced it is wood. Just the coloring that we see in this minute looking down, it's sort of suggestive of wood, but it could be almost anything.
Pergo?
Yeah. I don't think, it's probably linoleum, right, Jim? Yeah.
Yeah, it could be. One of the other things that in every, you must be tired seeing on every airship movie that there's the constant threat of fire and exploding Zeppelins. Yet there were places to smoke and things like that. How was smoking handled on a Zeppelin?
Very carefully.
But
Yeah, seriously. And the risk for smoking was primarily not that the hydrogen would really get into, because hydrogen goes up, right? You're smoking below it. It's hydrogen rises. The main risk of smoking is that you ignite something else. You start a fire. You smoke in bed and you set the bedding on fire, or you set a curtain on fire, or you set the walls. A lot of these rooms had fabric or silk walls, and so if you were careless with smoking material, you could start a fire, and then you were really in trouble. The Hindenburg had a smoking room that they widely advertised was pressurized. It had positive pressure in it so that nothing could leak in. Air could only leak out, but no hydrogen could leak in. And they had a very elaborate pressure door that you had to walk through. To some degree, that was a bit of a publicity ruse to sort of reassure people. It was a little bit of security theater. The main thing, the main protection for smoking was because you were smoking below the hydrogen. As long as you didn't light anything on fire, no hydrogen was going to come down and touch the tip of your cigarette. You had to be careful about igniting things, but it wasn't. I think a lot of the pressurized smoking room stuff was a little bit for show and to reassure passengers.
So Jenny flying off her flare gun in this in the cab of this is probably
that's not a good idea. That's
not a great idea regardless.
No, and having a flare gun in a Zeppelin is dangerous. And actually, there was a British airship, the R-101, which crashed in France in 1930. And a lot of people believe that the reason it ignited, it had a very gentle landing and a very survivable, gentle descent into some terrain. But then it burst into flame. And a lot of people think it was because of the flares that were kept in the cabin. So merely having flares is
already a bad idea. Well, speaking of causes of crashes, I know to this day there's still at least a little bit of debate. I think probably mostly among people who may not know better, but about the actual cause of the Hindenburg. So what's your take?
There really isn't a lot of serious debate about it. Scientists and historians all agree on the basics, which is that hydrogen leaked and it was ignited by an electrostatic discharge. Pretty much any other hypothesis has been ruled out. Where we get a little fuzzy are the really granular details. Where was the hydrogen leaking? What started the hydrogen leak? Those are things we may not ever know. And the nature of the electrostatic discharge, was it a coronal discharge? Was it brush discharge? Was it, as most people hypothesize, most likely a difference in potential between the skin and the framework, because the framework was grounded to the ground, but the skin was up about 60 to 80 meters in the air. So the exact mechanism of the electrostatic discharge is a little bit unclear, perhaps. But the essence is really simple. Hydrogen leaked, and there was an electrostatic spark, and it ignited the hydrogen, and the ship burned. The basics we've known for a long time.
Do you think there's any credibility whatsoever to the possibility of sabotage?
It's really hard to ever prove a negative.
Sure.
I don't know that anyone could ever prove that the ship wasn't sabotaged. All we know is that there was certainly no evidence of it. There was no reason to think it was sabotaged. Everything is far more consistent with the other theories, and there's nothing to show sabotage. On the other hand, had it been sabotage, there likely might not have been a lot of evidence. I mean, something as simple as a flashbulb could have ignited it. So it could have been sabotaged and there wouldn't have been much evidence left. But there's no reason to think that it was.
When we're watching as the Zeppelin leaves Griffith Park here, and
I love that scene.
Isn't it great? What a beautiful.
I love the scene when it first approaches the observatory. By the way, but I don't want to take you off your path.
No, that's fine. Yeah, that's one of my favorite scenes too. That's just that ominous view of this gigantic, an aluminum cloud flying over the observatory. As we're watching them flying over the lights of Los Angeles, it looks like, I would say they're at about maybe 800 to 1,000 feet. Is that about the average altitude for where did they usually fly at? What was their general range in the sky?
Hindenburg usually crossed the Atlantic at approximately 200 meters, roughly 600 feet. You don't want to go too high because the higher you go, the gas expands. And if you go high, the gas expands, it fills the gas cells, and then you have to let it out because otherwise it'll pop the gas cells and actually damage the girders. And you don't want to release it. This is the stuff that keeps you in the air. So you don't want to release it, you want to save it. There's a real reason not to fly too high. And there's not much reason to fly high. You can never fly high enough to get around the weather. There's not that much difference between 5,000 feet and 600 feet. So there's not a huge point in it, not enough to justify the loss of your lifting gas. And also it gave people a wonderful view. I mean, you're flying at 200 meters, 500-600 feet over the ocean. What a spectacular view!
Yeah, and when you get to Manhattan, you'd actually there'd be buildings taller than your ship at the time.
You were right there. You could see the people on the roofs waving at you, and they could see you in the windows of the ship waving back. You were right there. You flew over, the valleys of Europe. You flew over cathedrals and castles and cities. Just a spectacular view. I mean, I've been in, even today, if you fly in an airship, a blimp, a small Zeppelin, it's slow and you're slowly passing over the countryside and you're just looking down. It's an amazing way to fly.
And once again, I'm the only guy that hasn't.
Sorry.
Yes. If you've never done this, raise your hand. Oh, sorry, Jim.
Sit over here.
One of these days, we'll have to figure that out somehow. It took me 49 years or 47 years of wanting before I got my shot.
Yeah,
so
I'm going to go right to Mr. Goodyear.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Well, this has been fascinating. I've loved Zeppelins. I've loved airships since I was a little kid in New Jersey, and seeing the hangar number 1 in Lakehurst, and seeing the Goodyear blimp. I was once at a Little League game, and I think it was one of the blimps named Mayflower.
Yes, several blimps were called Mayflower.
I saw the Goodyear blimp Mayflower come over left field of my Little League field, and just I swear it was 10 feet off the ground. That's how it felt. It just
they're magical.
Yeah, they're just beautiful. It's like a whale in the sky.
To this day, there's no one who can not look up in the sky when an airship passes over. You just have to look at it. And the size, that scene where it first comes over the Griffith Observatory, one thing that's so magical about that and so great about this movie is it gives you a sense of the size.
Yeah.
You really get a sense of how big that was. And if you're watching this movie and you think they exaggerated, they didn't. That literally was how big it was, and how impressive it was when it first comes over the observatory. That's exactly what it did feel like to people who saw this thing, which was absolutely gigantic. And I think part of the magic and part of the thrill was just the sheer size. These things were many times the size of a modern-day blimp. And you get a sense of that in this movie. You get a sense of, wow, this thing is pretty impressive.
I may have shared with this with you in some of our chats earlier, Dan, and I probably mentioned it on the show, but I'll always think back to a story my dad has told his whole life since when he was 5 years old and seeing the Macon fly overhead when he was living in Los Angeles, and he was outside, playing on his own, and sees this thing sort of come out of a little bit of a misty, foggy day, and he was running door to door, banging on doors to find total strangers' houses, just trying to get somebody to come out and see this with him because it was so amazing. And the Macon was, if I'm remembering right, was nearly as big as Hindenburg, was maybe within 100 feet or so, something like that.
It was nearly as big, but it wasn't as big. Hindenburg and therefore Luxembourg were even bigger. It's the largest man-made object ever to fly.
Wow. Any chance of us seeing something like that again?
There is a real practical application for large cargo carrying airships these days because they can go to remote locations where there's no infrastructure, no port, no railway, no highway, no airport. And they can carry either heavy or bulky things like wind turbine blades and things like that, or oil drilling equipment, to a remote area where there's no point in laying a railway because they only need to go there once or twice. And so there's a real advantage to airships doing that, and there are a number of airship projects currently being built and worked on to accomplish that. I don't think we'll ever see large passenger airships again. It'd be too expensive, and there are some drawbacks. For one thing, you'd probably have to go 3 or 4 days without taking a shower because water is really heavy. And I'm just not sure how many people are going to pay $10 or $20 or $30,000 to take a 3-day cruise where they can never bathe. I would, but I'm not sure how many other people would.
Well, sign me up. I'd love to see this again, but maybe we'll see it. Dan, thank you again so much for being on the show. We're going to watch a bit of a tragedy in the next week as we lose the Luxembourg. It's great watching this movie with you, and thanks for being on our show.
Thank you so much.
For those of you who would like to join our conversation, talk your Zeppelin moments, please reach out to us. We're always available on social media. You can find us online on Twitter at Rocketeer Minute. You can find us at facebook.com/Rocketeer Minute. You can find us at the great big website, rocketeerminute.com. Dan, where can people find you online?
Twitter at airships. And of course, you can go to airships.net and there's contact information. And you can also, we also have a page on Facebook. If you go to airships.net, it will have links to the @airships Twitter account and also the Facebook page.
And of course, anybody interested in your terrific new book on Hindenburg can find that at Amazon.com, or I'm sure many other places as well.
I think we did a really good job. I'm very proud of the book, and I hope people enjoy it.
Cool. Well, please go to all those sites we mentioned and definitely read the book. But we will join you here tomorrow as we watch the continuing misadventures of the Luxembourg. We'll see you here tomorrow on the Rocketeer Minute. So until next time, over and out.